Sounds good. Let me jump in. Um, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. We'll keep this pretty casual. Feel free to jump in with questions at any time. Um, let's see, and we're down to 45 minutes, so I'll try to move through some of the earlier parts a little faster. But hey, everyone, we're going to talk about design systems today, and specifically design systems in Figma. Design systems is a big topic. It's been a part of a lot of conversation and writings for the last few years. So there's a lot to dive into there at a more kind of foundational level. I'm going to avoid most of that and just talk about how it relates to working in Figma. Um, I will, oh, hold on. I will very quickly touch on kind of three key things that we should know. A lot of times people, when talking about design systems, are really talking about a style guide or a pattern library. So knowing the difference between the three is useful. But mostly we'll spend our times looking at these in different examples of Figma design systems. We're also going to talk a little bit about this new feature that Figma just released just a couple of weeks ago, like 2 weeks ago or so, called variations, which feeds really nicely into setting up design systems. And if any of you were around for my webinars on building out components, it just makes your life a lot easier for doing that. And I want to leave a couple of minutes at the end just to show you, not just tell you, but show you very quickly a couple of different resources that are out there. Cool. So let's jump in. And again, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. So when people talk about design systems, um, it's not always consistent in what they're saying. And so starting from kind of the bottom up, a design system is actually composed of a couple other things. At the first level, you have your style guide, and that is your text styles, your visual styles, colors, visual treatments, all those kinds of things. Um, Oftentimes it includes brand elements, and then there's also, of course, UI elements if you're creating digital products. Excuse me. Next up, you have your pattern library. These are components essentially in Figma, but it's more abstractly, it's patterns that your application, your product, your platform reuses often and have been shown to be valuable. And so you're reusing this. And at the last level, you have your design system, which ties together, which collects all of this, but also goes one step further to actually provide guidance and instruction on how to use it. Um, so that you can imagine that when you collect it all and then also take that extra step of providing the guidance, that's a lot of work. That takes actually building that and maintaining that is itself a whole it's often referred to as a product for products. It's a whole bunch of effort unto itself. So the one thing to clarify for yourself right up front is, do you even need a design system? And it's also something you build up to organically, starting with making sure your style guide set up your pattern library, and then a design system if you're now working across multiple teams, multiple products. Okay, so let's actually take a look at what this looks like. So in terms of in Figma, when we're talking about your style guide, that's this right here. If you see where my cursor is on the right column, this is where all your styles are located. And you can, whenever you write something, have it, just have uh, kind of local settings, fonts, colors, things like that. But really what you should do is make sure you have your text styles well defined. I have some very simple ones for these slides I made. Your color styles, possibly some effects. Your guides and layout grids can go into here. I'll show you examples of different design systems where they do some pretty cool things. But setting up your style guide in Figma is essentially just at the first level, just having this, making sure you've made styles out of your different visual elements and structured them and named them well. The other part, your pattern library, is basically your asset library. I don't have any assets in this file right now because it's just a few slides, but this is where all your components go, and making sure you have made components out of things, you've made components out of the states of things, and you've organized them in a useful way. If you've done all of that, you're kind of on your way. The next thing you might do is actually lay those things out in a page for just the elements to provide an easier reference. So let's start looking at some examples. This is a design system made by Atlassian, who are the people that make Jira, Confluence, things like that. And so typically, if you are making a design system file for whatever you're doing, people like to make a cover, let you know what you're looking at. Sorry, actually, let's go back here. You can also see they have their style guide set up right here. All their text styles are defined, their color styles, all different shades of blues and reds. They also do something really interesting if you go way down here at the bottom, where they've actually defined images, these avatar images, as colors. So in Figma, background images are controlled at the same place that you control colors. So you can actually do something really cool where you just set up these different kind of placeholder people. They have a photographic set, they have this illustrated set called meeples as colors, and so you can just select it at any time as a color and it fills it in. So I thought that was pretty clever. And then they have their styles, and they've also defined their grids and rows and things like that. So that's set up. You can see that their assets are well set up. All their icons, different objects. So that part of it, your basic style guide and pattern library is all set up. And then they've gone ahead and kind of laid these things out for reference. So you have all your avatar images, your colors, but you can see that they don't have anything on this page actually explaining what anything is. That's okay to some extent because you can go to your inspect tab and get details on anything that you want to get details on, your CSS, your colors. So it's fine to have it here just as a place for people to come and get details on things, but there's not much guidance in terms of what to do with anything. You can see things are just kind of thrown in here, and you really see it when you go to this page called grid, and there seems like there's nothing here. And in fact, there are some things here. So you have to kind of know what's here. So I wouldn't necessarily call this a design system, but it's a start. And it may be that this is all they actually need in order for the team to move forward. Just having this repository of everything is enough. By contrast, we're going to look at this design system by a company called NG, I believe, and they call it Fluid. People do like naming their design systems. And here they've actually gone ahead and started just with instructions for the team. Hey, designers, read before designing this. Make sure you use the library in this way. Here's how you browse components. They've provided a lot of instructions. They have instructions here. If this is used using Figma's team accounts where you can share component libraries across many teams, there's a whole process of publishing components and people accepting components. So they've kind of given you instructions here, how to know that components have been updated, when to publish it. So you can see that they've really started putting in a lot of guidance on how to do things, how to use components and layers within components, fonts, standard plugins they use, even some introductory information on atomic design, which is somewhat academic, but they're giving people instructions here. So when we think about a really mature design system, it's kind of at this level. You have definitely your styles you see on the right, you have your assets, but then you also have guidance for people. And then you get into the different sections of it. So here are your core elements, your fonts, your logos, fonts, your colors are all laid out. You can see that they've set up, organized it such that here's all their headings, here's the examples. They're repeating the name of the style in the example over here. And you can see it also comes over here. A couple of interesting things to call out. A pretty nice practice to do is in the name of the actual style, they're also putting in what size it is. That's a nice shortcut for people working with it, for devs to quickly know and have that reference and not have to go inspect for it. So now we see like what we think of typically as a design system, where they've taken the time to really lay all this out. One other thing they've done here that I want to call out really quickly is giving you a preview of what the details are for this style right here. And of course, you could also always get that from the Inspect tab, whether you want your CSS or your general typography info. They wanted to be nice and put it here for a reference. I used to do that myself when I set up systems. I moved away from it because it just adds a whole other layer of maintenance where you have to go in and every time you make changes, make sure you update all of this. So it's nice to have, but it is a lot more work. So you can always get those right out of the Inspect. So you may consider not bothering with this, just making sure you have the examples well set up. So yeah, you can see they've set up more guidance, spacing, grids, all these details. It's not just invisible squares on a screen. They've given you sizes and references. And they've set this up in an atomic structure, so their core, their atoms, which are avatars, badges, links, buttons, all this fun stuff. Then their molecules, and then their organisms, their page components. And they've also been nice and given you a little explanation of what it means, what an organism actually is. And then lastly, they have a page that they call symbols. Whoever set this up, I think, was used to working in Sketch and Figma. You could call it components to be consistent with Figma terminology. And what they've put here is all of their master components. So you can see by the 4-diamond icon that these are all the master components. So these are really the source of everything you see in the other pages. Whenever you see these things in the other pages, well, these aren't actually components, but any of these, you'll see that they're instances. So it really is more than just a repository. The repository is the symbols page. Here it's the reference, where they're taking instances and making sure they give you examples of every possible state that you might need to see for this. And this is, I think, generally good practice. You don't have to do it, but you'll see that pretty commonly as you put all your masters on a separate page from where you're showing all your references. The Atlassian library did not do that. These are all the masters. They just kept it on one page. All right, I'm going to go through a few more quickly. So this is from Spotify. It's their Backstage design system and UI kit. And I believe this is something that they released to the general public to use when making things for Backstage. So they're even more guided in what they present. They have a lot of instructions, links to resources, links to other pages, general kind of introductions, and instructions on how to do different things. Of course, they also have everything standard set up over here: style guides, assets, etc. One thing that they did that I noticed was a little, well, I can make some guesses as to why they did it, but they didn't use the slash notation for their text. They just left it in one big long chunk, which isn't so great for organization when you want to actually make changes. So you want to change it. It's not so well organized, but maybe they had reasons for doing that. They did do it they use a slash notation for all their colors to separate their UI color sets from their brand color sets, which is useful. Another thing they did, which is pretty common, you notice, is they have a blank page here, which is just a bunch of lines in the title. There's a couple of things you can do along these lines of when you set up a design system and when you set up files and projects in Figma in general, treat the workspace as a UI because other people will navigate through it. So kind of the same principles you would apply to setting up a UI, you should apply over here. So they're using these blank pages with just line dashes as a title to just divide out the sections of their design system because these pages are essentially they're organizing. This is the organization of everything that's in here. So here's all their section on type, right? And so here's all their examples, color, and then they get into their components and all their component examples. As things start getting a little more complicated, even at the level of buttons, they're also including a UI example of showing you these components in context so you can see how it's supposed to work. And it goes on for a while. There's quite a bit in here. They didn't put all their masters on a single page, maybe because of just how much there is. They decided to keep it all on the place where they show it, which could be fine also. It's kind of up to you. All right, the next one we're going to look at is probably the one most people think about when they think about a design system these days. This is your Google Material Design System. So the way they do it, they start with similar to what they have on their material design website. You know, they have kind of these getting started pages with table of contents, instructions, references. This is itself a lot of design just to set this up so you can see how much work could go into actually creating a mature design system at this level. Once you get, sorry, did I jump back too far? Yep. And then after that, they go into their sections. These are their high-level themes, their typography references. You can see here all they have called out kind of some of the details here, as well as the titles, colors, elevation, all the things that they feel are important for their design system. They even have some references for how things should layer when this gets built out, let's say in Angular or whatever front-end framework is being used, which is important for them because if you remember with material design, there's some animations that happen on hover and things like that. So structuring things properly is important. So they made it a point to call that out. Then material design system files that I've seen generally have this layout where they are set up where they have a sticker sheet. So this is your high level kind of repository of all possible things, your buttons, your call the fab, the cards, different types of cards, etc. And then they have the component page. So this is all your, these are instances for reference. And then the components page is all your masters. If you want to go and update the master, you'd do that here and it would push it out to everything else. All right, let's see, 12:30. Let me show you a couple more. And then you can see they built out a similar design system for all of their dark UI. So went through the work of setting up the whole thing again with all possible references and references and information for the dark UI. Another one we're going to look at, this is for Airtable. And here you can see it's all on one page. These are all the masters. They give you a nice cover here, just to be nice, I guess. It's fun for people to have something that they can kind of gather around as a reference, as a visualization for what this is. But then they've just really just organized all their elements, provided guidance when needed. Here are your headings, all your icons, your colors. And that's fine. Again, this is one thing to remember when you're working in design systems is unlike the old days where, say, a style guide was something an agency created and it was a printed document and only got updated once every few years. Nowadays, these are all living artifacts. So we treat this, we let this evolve in the same agile way that we let any other product evolve. We want to see changes in real time, and we don't want to get too far ahead, lock anything in prematurely. We want to let it evolve as patterns become apparent. They really do become patterns. And it's worth putting into the design system. Little aside, I read something once that said making a design system should be boring. And that's a little bit facetious, but it is actually true. While there's a lot of hype around design systems, what you're trying to put into a design system is everything that's been very standardized. You want to be a little careful about putting things in here that might change, that might evolve, that aren't really in constant reuse, because not only might that become a headache to maintain as it changes, it also potentially puts limits on what people can do, how people can experiment in the work they're doing, because they feel they have to stick to this pattern because we've identified it as a pattern. So again, you don't have to jump into Google Material Design's many pages. You let this evolve as the system itself evolves. All right, so this one is for Uber. And so again, it's a single page. They've kind of just put notes in, as needed, like this is your base. One thing that's interesting here is there are actually no assets here. This is a file that they release to the public to use, and you can copy components out of it as you need, but you can't actually access the master components. They still maintain the master components. And so if you use these components, they can make updates to it and it'll push out to anything that you do. So it's interesting to see a company doing this, releasing this to the public, but maintaining control of the master. All right. I'm going to show you a couple of don'ts and then get into the variants. So this is another one I found online called the Pegasus Design System. They put a lot of effort into making stuff look nice, putting, not just the blocks, but, they actually style the layout of the presentation quite a bit. But they did something which is highly not recommended when you're setting up design systems. So here they have their display large text style. If you click on it though, you see that no style is actually applied to it. It's just a local style, local text settings. What that means is if at any point, this is your display large, which is right here, if I was to go in and make changes to the settings for the display large text style, those changes would not get reflected over here. So you would have to then go back and manually update everything in your design system to reflect the updates. And that's just a lot of work that you don't need to do. I don't know why they did it that way. If it was the case that they wanted this page, because they put so much effort into the layout of these things, if it was the case that they wanted this page to maintain its coherence, that again goes against the whole point of having living design systems in Figma, which is that you want things to update in real time and to reflect exactly how things look right now. So this should really not have local styles applied. It should, be the style. And you can see it changed right there when I applied it. So there was a discrepancy between how this is shown here and what this display large style actually is. And we don't ever want that. We want what you see in the reference to be exactly what exists in your style guide and your assets. The last thing I'm going to talk about on here, which is the next topic that I mentioned, is variations, which is new and really cool. Before I get into it though, I want to just take a pause. It's been pretty quiet. I want to check if anyone has any questions so far.
Hey, great timing. Before we move into variations, we do have a couple of questions that came up.
Okay.
One of which is, as some folks on the call may not be as familiar with design systems, I know you said we're not going to get too far into the principles, as this is mainly around how to use Figma in which to set it up in various ways people have done so before. But we do have one that I think is really helpful for the group to understand. Can you give an example of something that's like canon or set information that would be reusable that you would want to codify into a design system versus something that may evolve as the project evolves?
Got it. Yeah, so this is, you could see, you could consider that style guide plus pattern library. Let me actually go back to this one sec. You could actually say that style guide plus pattern library plus guidance equals a design system, right? So the stuff that you definitely want to codify, your style guide, all your text settings, your headings, your body fonts, you definitely want that locked in. And one reason for doing that is to really start limiting variations. If you're working on SaaS applications, web-based applications, you really want to try to limit yourself to 2 fonts. You want to make sure that little things like all your line heights and spacings are uniform. Otherwise, your application can start looking very janky. And developers, when they're working, aren't necessarily paying attention to those details. So as basic as it seems, just locking those things in is really important. Next up, and or if it hasn't been done, what often is the case is a designer will have to go and do an audit across the board of an application and kind of retrofit what these things should be, and then clean up where there's deviations from it. The other,
Right.
go ahead, sorry.
Oh, nothing. I was just gonna, what you said resonated with me in terms of like the things that you really wouldn't want to change to make a lot of the different pages within an experience very dissimilar from one another. Things like the font sizing, the type of button styles that you
Right.
have, just so people are not searching for how to navigate or use the website or the application you're designing. Those types of consistent nuggets. I think Brad Frost, if anybody's familiar, coins the term atomic design. These are like the atoms which make up a larger experience, that those things should be consistent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So your fonts, your body and heading fonts, captions, those standard things. Buttons is the next most common thing in a design system, and making sure you have clear distinction between your primary and secondary states, things like that. So having those components ready to go um, is pretty standard. As you said, Devin, the atoms you want to lock in. It starts getting more gray as you start getting more towards molecules and especially towards organisms, because those might vary up based on context and need. And you don't want to limit designers from being able to solve the right problem for what they're designing for. But the kind of Lego blocks they use to, or the atoms they use to solve those things, you want to standardize.
Right.
Another, uh, real quick, another way to think about it is you want to put in here the stuff that designers shouldn't have to think about, so they can focus on the stuff that they really do need to think about. What problems are they trying to solve? Not what button styles they need to solve that problem.
I love that. So if you're designing like a search engine, maybe the new way to search, maybe that you have a scoped search so you can pre-filter for certain categories and things. That's like the big hairy beast you want to solve for. You don't want to have to solve for what does the button look like in the search field? What does the search box look like? Those things may be already pre-programmed and put in the style guide, right? I
Exactly.
love the
Yep.
way you put that. The things that we don't want to have to think about.
Yep.
Another question, and maybe you'll get there as part of when we talk about style guide, or not style guides, design systems. Inevitably, there's two sides of the coin. One is exactly as you described it, and we described it for the group around the decisions that we don't really want or need to think about as designers. We want to solve the more complex problems. What about the other side of the coin for the developers or the programmers? How does Figma help to provide, like, or does it provide code or front end styles for programmers? Can you talk a little bit more about how that a design system that's created in Figma might be used by a programmer?
Yep. So there's some plugins that promise make the promise of exporting usable code from Figma into React or Angular, things like that. I haven't personally tested those out, but my general finding is it's a reference. It's not usable code. Now, those plugins might do things that I'm not aware of, so take it with a grain of salt. Um, but generally, programmers are able to do is come here, go to the inspect tab, and get CSS details to some extent for anything they're doing, font styles that are used, things like that, and have those references. However, I don't think everything that's shown here as CSS is exactly how it should be built out. For example, here font sizes are only shown in pixel sizes, but best practice when you're building out components is to use relative sizes, REMs. And Figma doesn't give you font sizes and REMs. You can do the math. An REM is generally 6 pixels, and so whenever I set stuff up, I use multiples of 8 or sorry, it's generally 16 pixels. So I'll use multiples of 8 or 16. So it always translates well to REMs, but it doesn't give you that by default. So there is that little bit of a gray space. And ultimately, when you're talking about your component library, the true component library exists in whatever front-end framework that the developers have built out. However, what you're providing here is the kind of prototyping component library for the design team as they build out new prototypes for the developers.
Right. So this is like step one. Once you align on all the styles, that those decisions that you don't want to have to make every single time as a designer, it helps you create the artifact quicker with not as much thinking about those atoms. You can think about solving the complex problems. But the next step to a design system, once you have those things codified, would you say is something like working with a developer to then create all the actual front end styles for that? And maybe you even then have a digital version of this?
Yeah, ultimately, someone is building the front end components and putting them into a framework. I mean, these days, no one's doing it from scratch using Angular, React, or something like that. And so everything that you see here in the inspect, all of the CSS is locked into the Angular component structure of this button when it gets built out. So the developer will build that out, and a designer should be doing a design review of everything that's built and just double checking that it's to the standards and kind of definitions that they've set up over here. So you wouldn't necessarily export from here, but you would have some design oversight over the components getting built, make sure they fit the system as designed.
Great. Well,
One
I
other,
put a plug out for any other questions, but we can move forward to variations if you'd like.
yeah, I'll say one other short thing about kind of exporting usable code. The other end of the spectrum, to some extent, with prototyping platforms is Framer, which actually is set up such that you're setting up your components, your actual React components, right in the prototyping tool. But the threshold to using it and the speed at which you can use it the threshold goes way up very quickly, and the speed goes way down very quickly. And I will say from personal experience, I've tried to shortcut, prototyping to development by doing more like code ready things, and you just lose so much speed that it ends up not being worth it. So the real value of a prototyping platform and specifically something like Figma is how quickly you can generate and test an idea. And so I've kind of resigned myself to, it's better to design fast, test it, and then let the front end people do the actual building out versus trying to merge those two into a single step, which slows down kind of both things. Okay, so what are we talking about? Variations. All right. So you've probably seen in design systems, these kind of setups where there's all your different button states. And in the past, each one of these in Figma would have been a different component that you could swap between. But if you look at what's actually happening here right now, this big collection of many, many buttons is actually one component called button. And you know that it's a single component by the 4 diamonds that you see off to the left. And so this is a master component for a button. Within that, each button is a variation of the button component. And so Figma has introduced a new icon for that, which is a solid diamond. So master components, if you remember, have 4 diamonds. Component instances have a diamond with an outline. And so this is now a filled in diamond, solid diamond, which is your variation. And so each of these is a variation of this button component. Here's what that means. If you select the button component at large, you'll see over here for variants, there's a couple of things that are set up. There's properties, and you can add new properties. So whoever set this up defined size as a property and a couple of values for that, large, medium, small. They define type as a property and state as a property. If you wanted to, you could add more. You could change the name of these. These could be anything you want. And then when you click into this, you can see that for this variant, the size has been defined as large, the type has been defined as primary, and the state has been defined as initial. If you want to add a new state, you could always go here and just add a new one for any of these. Or if you want to add more properties, you could always do that. So what that means is now, if I was to just make a copy of this button, in the past, if you wanted to swap button states, you'd go over here and do a swap instance. And let's give our button a little name. So you'd go here to swap it, but you see there's only 2 swap options, your button and your button with your icon only. Whoever set this up set it up well. I didn't lose my label when I swapped between the 2. So it's really like distinct types of buttons now is all you have to swap between. If you want to change the state of the button itself, you can select it, and over here now you see the properties and the values. You can change any of these. So let's say I want to go from a large to a medium or a small button. I'm going to change from the primary to the secondary. I'm going to change to the focus state. It's all just variants of the button. You don't have to go swapping stuff out anymore. So a really powerful way now to set up all your states, and kind of by default structured to be useful for design systems, where you basically have this whole collection just laid out showing all the different states. And then the person has been kind enough to actually label the columns and the rows so you know what you're looking at. So here's your primary row, secondary row, your subtle row, and then all the different states for each of those rows. So yeah, that's variants, a new way to do states for things, and then also show those within your design system. Figma rolled out a couple of new features. Variants was one, and another, which totally off topic for here, was auto layout being closer to Flexbox, and that's some really nice features too. So they've been doing some good updates. That's it for variants. I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes just showing you a couple of useful communities and references. But any questions on variants before I move on to that?
No questions on variants specifically so far in the chat. So let's go ahead and move forward. And then I do have a juicy question to end the time today.
All right, cool. I'll go through this last part quickly then. So a couple of things to look at. Figma, the new community feature that Figma launched, which, sorry, I actually have right here. When you're in Figma, if you go to the main Figma tab, community is one of the locations you can go to. And if you haven't seen it already, highly recommend it. It's just a collection of Figma files that you can copy over that people are sharing. And I got a few of the design systems I showed you from here. So you can just take any of these files, copy it over to your account, play around with it, learn from it, use the components, whatever you want to do. They're organized by topics. So if you want to look at just design system files or grab a quick UI kit for yourself, it's super useful. And in fact, if you go to design system, you'll actually see a file that Figma released about variants. And I think I have that up over here. So you can grab this for yourself if you want to learn more about variants. They walk you through all the details of it, how to use it, how to set it up and work with it, so on and so forth. So your community, the Figma community, definitely recommend that you check that out. Another thing I wanted to show specifically around design systems is there for Figma is there's this website that says called Design Systems for Figma, and it collects design systems from all different organizations. This is where I got several of the ones that I showed you. So the Atlassian one, the Google one, material design systems are down here. So if you want to explore how different people are setting up design systems, you can grab those from here. And the last thing I wanted to show you is, it seems obvious, but just Googling design system versus style guide, there's a lot of really useful articles from just general kind of explanations. I thought this visualization was actually pretty useful, showing how a design system encompasses style guides, component libraries, but adds on these other things, information architecture, taxonomies, all of these other things that aren't inherent in these two. Let's see. Sorry, I'll show you a few other tabs. Structuring things. UXPin has a good article. InVision released an article recently around a lot of details around it, even getting into specifics of kind of typography best practices and things like that. Which one was this? UX Collective. This person had a very short kind of walkthrough of the differences. If you want a very quick intro to the differences, that's a good one. And these are all within the first 10 releases results when you do that search. And then this one gives you a nice listing of popular design systems, starting, of course, with material design, the most well-known one. Another one that's very popular right now to reference, Polaris by Shopify, so on and so forth, Apple's Human Interface Guidelines, so on. So yeah, a few references that I would recommend. Design systems for Figma, the Figma community, which if you have a Figma account, which you should because it's free, it's accessible to you, and then just Googling design systems versus style guide for some really good articles.
That's great. I really love how we ended on all these amazing resources. I sent the design systems for Figma in the chat, so hopefully everyone had a chance to copy and paste that into your browser. If you hadn't, go ahead and do that now, just so that way you can access that great information. And I guess the last, just one quick question, and then one maybe not so quick question to end our time. I know that you had just showed a couple of great examples of companies that publish their design system. Why is it that companies do that? Why publish their design system for the world to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, well, there's two reasons. One could be if you're actually co-creating with the greater audience. So Backstage, for example, by Spotify, they're releasing this UI kit for people to make things for Backstage. And similarly for Apple's kind of human interface guidelines. If you're creating apps for Apple, for iOS, they want to maintain a certain design standard for all apps on their platform. So co-creation is a huge reason to do it, similarly for Google and Google Play and everything that integrates with the Google ecosystem. So that's one big one. The other part of it, I would say, is brand equity, honestly. When a company becomes big enough, like Google or Shopify or some of these others, that they want to almost start setting standards. They want to be seen as thought leaders. They want to attract designers to the company. It's a way, it's a very kind way to build that kind of leadership by actually showing all your thinking that went into your design system, which then makes it easier for other people to just adopt and do. So it's helpful to designers to have a quick reference, to not have to figure out a set of standards on their own. And it also gets people using kind of your way of doing things, which starts making you kind of the benchmark of the table stakes for the space. So the brand side is one, and then the direct co-creation is the other, I would say.
I love that. Yeah, it's really interesting to see companies, they do different things to attract different types of talent. And companies like Spotify and Facebook and Google are just so huge in the tech industry. Obviously, they're tech leaders. And so when you're trying to attract that kind of talent, it makes a lot of sense that you'd want to tout your accomplishments like a really polished design system. The last
Right.
question I
Oh.
had, we had it last time as well, and I'll end on this, is why Figma over Sketch?
Oh, that is not the shortest way I would answer that is speed, efficiency, and the fact that it's on the, well, so Figma is integrated design, prototyping, and publishing for kind of the broader team. So it takes the place of not just Sketch, but Sketch, something like Zeppelin, and then whatever you use to actually share prototypes from Sketch, which would be InVision or something like that. So a closer like oranges to oranges comparison might be Figma versus the new InVision design tool, where Sketch is not on the cloud, it's localized, and all you can do is work. You have to use other tools to share the work that you're doing. So that's kind of one thing, just the workflow is completely different. The other is Figma is optimized for speed. It doesn't have as many features as many other tools have, whether it's UX Pin or possibly InVision, things like Axure, obviously. But it is just so fast in how you can move through things. I believe that's why it's gaining traction, is it allows you to get your ideas created quickly, get your references to developers quickly, and then they can start building it, which is where the real work is. Honestly, I have to say, because for us as designers, it's easy for us to do anything in any tool to some extent. Building it is hard, right? So the faster we can do it, the more we can do it in incremental kind of releases, such that developers have more reasonable scope to build things, the better projects move forward. So Figma really forces you to think that way.
Right. For folks who weren't able to make the prior two sessions that we had around Figma, Arijit actually walked us through how, because Figma is done within the cloud and sort of online, you have like this singular workspace that's then synced amongst multitudes of designers, rather than, like you mentioned, Sketch, which has this whole upload and maybe finding the Google Drive, whatever that is, version control becomes a lot more difficult, and you may need separate plugins and things. So I love how you said that this is sort of the one-stop shop, and that's probably why we're seeing a lot of traction there.
And that workflow changes everything in how you work. It isn't just one component, it kind of changes. And the transparency aspect of it too. So when when I work in Figma, the file I create is the reference. I don't have to create separate references. I annotate it, it works. Developers can go right in and get what they need out of it. It changes everything.
Well, thank you so much, Arijit. I really do appreciate it. Apologies to everybody again for the late start, but really got a packed agenda. We're able to make it through all of that. If there's any other questions for Arijit, he is found on Slack. So you can go ahead and reach out to him there. We will be posting the recording to our new repository that IDF has started, where you can access all the prior recordings and walkthroughs that we've done. So you should be able to access the other Figma Lunch and Learns as well. Thanks to everybody who could be a part of this, and to thanks again to Arijit for walking us through. I know that was really incredible, and nice to see how Figma once again proves to be a little bit more efficient and a little bit more of like that driving force for the industry now. So it's exciting to see where we might go. I remember designing websites in Photoshop and then moving to Sketch, and now we're doing something else entirely with Figma. So it's really exciting. Thanks again for walking us through. All right.
It was my pleasure. Bye, Ben.